Hello, welcome back, or good to see you again, or something like that. Even though you're seeing me, but I'm not seeing you. But I feel like I can imagine you sitting out there. This talk is the preparatory talk for exam two. That was a very poor way of putting it. Um, this is intended to help you prepare for the exam. In an in-course or in-class, in-person course, the lecture before the midterm, I always take some time to go over the exam, go over preparing for it, and those kinds of things. Now, the basic approach, in terms of strategies, in terms of what's expected on the IDs, and so I went over in the preparatory talk for exam one. So I'm not going to repeat that here. And so you might want to review it, perhaps, in terms of how to approach the terms, the short essays, and then the essay. So I think that's should cover that because it hasn't changed. Nothing has changed in terms of that for exam two or exam three or exam four even. The terms have changed, but in terms of uh, answering those terms, what's expected, that encyclopedia entry, so to speak, that I mentioned as a way of going about it, what it is, who it is, context, and why it's important in an explicit sense of why is it important, why is it on this exam. Those are the things that need to be there. Still, a minimum of a half a page, double spaced, and 12-point font, um, but there's no maximum. And the more you can include, the better. And also, anything that's related to the term. When you put it in context, that relatedness to other terms on the list of terms to know can help in terms of the context and the significance and the importance. But for today, well, not today, but for this exam and this talk, I'm going to focus just on the essay because even though, again, the basics are the same in terms of presenting an argument, and you might want to review again the document historical argument, um, it is still the challenge, so to speak, is to break down the essay. And discerning and deciphering what the essay is really asking is in many ways part of the exam. I think I mentioned that before. That's still the case. So I want to help you go through that. And you may say, okay, well, why don't you just be straightforward in the exam, in the question that you ask? Well, part of that is, I believe, um, as I talked about a bit, and or in the introduction to the course document, um, this is not a course about information. This is a course about how you put things together, what you do with what you learn. That is what the essay question is about. The terms is primarily more information. Do you know when they were, where they were, why they're important, what the context was, how do they relate to other aspects of the course material? But the essay is getting you to think. And part of that is really trying to say, okay, what is this question getting at? There's no way to answer my questions, if you haven't seen that already, as yes or no, basically. It is a position that you have to defend. You have to construct an argument. And you need to say, okay, what is the core part of this question? So I'm just going to read it to you, if I can get this up without messing up my technology here. The essay for part two, as you should know, because by now you're probably working on it already, or you should have been, because as I think I said, the exams themselves can function as a study guide for the material as you're going through, since you have them available. That's how I think you could use them. But here we go with the short essay. This is part two. And again, short essay, approximately 3 to 5 pages. So don't confuse the short essay uh, of the essay, part two of the exam, with the short essays of part one, which is a minimum of a half a page. And again, here in part two, there's no maximum. What was the role of myth in the emergence and development of Christendom? How did Christendom then become transformed into early modern Europe? How does the development of Christendom from approximately or circa 400 to approximately or circa 1560 compare with developments of Buddhism and Islam? To what extent can we understand world history during this period as an increasing conflict of myths, religions? Now, it's a complex question. And again, it's one of those things that there's no way you can answer it. You can answer it if you wrote 4 or 5 books on it. And it's one of those questions that there is no definitive final answer. What you need to do is to take into account, again, the course material, the lectures, and the textbook. Now, I talked about myth and how I use the term myth in the lectures. So that is going to be central in getting at this question. And so if you just read over that, and I'm not assuming anybody would read over my lectures, you should go back and review what I had to say about myth and how to use it in a historical sense, what I mean by myth in a historical context. It's not falsehoods. It is getting at an experienced reality, and there's all kinds of philosophical issues around that part of it, but it's a different type of truth. And so if we look at Christianity as a myth, if we look at Buddhism as a myth, if we look at Islam as a myth, if we look at Protestantism and the emerging Roman Catholicism as a myth, or 2 different Christian myths, or 2 different forms of Christian myths, because that's really what we're getting at here, is that there's the overarching myth, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, or atheism, or whatever you want, but that's not part of this question. And then there are the various, let's say, sub-myths interpreting, experiencing that overall myth. So when it says, to what extent can we interpret the emergence of early modern Europe as a conflict of religions, or myths, or do I say myths? Conflict of myths, religions. Yeah, conflict of myths, religions. That is getting at both within Christianity, within Christendom, essentially talking about those developments that I refer to as the Reformation, Protestant Reformation, but also then the relationship of Christian Europe with the wider world, because Islam had been expanding from early on. Crusades, that should be something that you address in here. Buddhism is not as confrontational with Christianity based on the course material. There was little interaction between Christians in medieval and early modern Europe with Buddhists. So what does that tell us too then about that myth? I think I've referred to before, certainly I will in part 3, I think in part 2 as well, a bit towards the end, how Christianity really started to look outside and quote unquote expand Christendom, Christian Europeans, expand their horizons to the rest of the world in terms of the age of discovery, beginnings of colonization, which I think I referred to in one of the last lectures, but we'll really focus on in part 3. But here, saying, okay, so where do I get the information about Islam? Well, that's in the textbook. Oh, excuse me. Well, it is, but also for Buddhism. I spent very little time. I think I may have mentioned Islam, but I didn't really talk about it too much. But the book covers it, and that is where we need to see, okay, what were those interactions? Now, if you wanted to, I don't remember offhand, I have to go back to look how much the book goes into this, but the tensions within Christendom between Christians and Jews. Because Judaism, we can say too, is a myth, a distinct myth from Christianity, but yet still they're related and connected. And so there's conflicts there. And so we see a rise of anti-Semitism, I think I addressed in the lectures in light of the Black Death, and on we go. Now, how did then Christianity, let's say the myth of Christendom, affect its own development? So what do you mean by that? So, well, let's see. How does your own self-perception, how you conceive of yourself, affect and influence how you act? Because in some ways, one's own self-perception of themselves is their own myth. And of course, that gets complicated because we have that sense of, who am I as I'm sitting in my room? We have that sense of Who do I portray myself as being? We have that myth of whom do I want to be? And all those kind of things fuse. Now, I'm not trying to say we need to psychoanalyze medieval Christendom, but what we need to do is recognize those various dimensions and say, okay, if you have a concept of yourself, just think about it for a minute. How does that affect your actions in society? That's what this question is getting at in terms of the myths and religions in early modern Europe, both for Christianity and for Islam and for Buddhism. So what was it about Buddhism that did not lead to, let's say, the attempt to proselytize the world or evangelize the world or establish colonies all over the world? And then we're talking about within Southeast Asia and within Asia as such. Buddhism was very influential and was spreading, but there were conflicts there too. And also with other minor religions that you can certainly bring in, minor, either various forms of Buddhism, with Hinduism certainly as well. And so how do we bring those all together? And then Islam. So we have this conglomeration of political power, religious belief that is fused, I would say, both in Christianity and in Islam and in Buddhism. And that fusion of religion with politics conditions, affects, brings about conflicts, internal and external, or let's say, quote unquote, domestically and internationally. What's the role thereof? When the age of exploration, was it simply greed? Was it state policy? Was it politics? Was it religious fervor? In so many ways, I would say is all of those all together. And in our modern understanding, it's like those don't fit together. And that's one of the things I want you to try to see and get at. That at this time, in pre-modern, which includes early modern, modernity is where we're getting to in this course, because that really begins in the late 18th century, on 19th century, and into the 20th century. So the pre-modern period, before 1800, is what we're talking about. Religion and politics are one and the same. And economic gain is part of that as well. Political dimensions, the religious dimensions, and belief dimensions are all mixed up that we can't really distinguish them except for purposes of analysis. We can't say, oh, here we see a contradiction. Well, they weren't really being Christian. Well, they may not have been being Christian as we see it. But they were certainly being Christian as they saw it. If that makes sense? And the same with Islam and Buddhism. I mean, Islam, after Muhammad dies in 632, there is tensions, excuse me, shortly thereafter between what became the Sunnis and the Shiites. And this still is with us today. That's all over the interpretation and understanding of Muhammad's heritage and what do we do about it. Now, that's the internal part of it, but then that has that external dimension, which we see with the spread of Islam from early on, leading to the Crusades, leading to, in some ways, the Islamic radicalism today. So that's kind of the broader context, and that's what this question is getting at. You can say, well, shouldn't this be a class in comparative religion? I would say no. The topics could be the same, but the approach is different, and the questions are kind of different. This is very much trying to look at the context. I mean, I don't want to read essays saying, well, Christianity basically worshipped God and Jesus, and this is what they believed. Buddhism followed the Buddha. This is what the Buddha was like. This is some of their positions. Enlightenment, life is suffering, those kinds of things. And Islam followed Muhammad, the final revelation, and that's how we can see. And there's really not much comparison between them because they're three very distinct religions, except we could say, for example, that Islam, in so many ways, is a continuation, or at least viewed itself as this continuation of the same revelation that first was there in Judaism and then in Christianity. This is the final revelation with Islam, so it's part of the same tradition. Whereas Buddhism is a very different tradition, and Buddhism, we could even question, was not really a theistic religion. Certainly Zen Buddhism wasn't, and I know Zen Buddhism better than other forms of Buddhism. But it's an issue of enlightenment leading to nirvana, and then the bodhisattvas who put off their own enlightenment, because enlightenment is like, okay, now I'm enlightened, I'm basically in nirvana, so I'm no longer really in this life. But the bodhisattvas said, okay, no, we need to teach this out of our own compassion for the way. That actually comes from Taoism, this concept of the way, the Tao, that's the way. And Taoism remained as a religious belief, or kind of a philosophical / religious belief, also not based on a deity. So there's a whole different approach to the divine. So that's a comparison and contrast. But that's not really what I am expecting here. I mean, you're welcome to bring that all in, because that's part of it. But it is, what historical difference did it make? Why was it that there weren't Buddhists in Europe? There are today, but why wasn't there Buddhists in the Middle Ages or in the 16th century? Why was Islam seen as the infidel, the outsider? Why did Islam view Christianity as, a lower form that needed to be instructed? Why did Buddhism, why weren't there bodhisattvas that said, okay, we need to explain and enlighten Islam and Christianity? First of all, there's very little connection or contact. Missionary activities to the East by Christianity, by Europeans, we're just coming in at the tail end of this period. Some fascinating, interactions there. But that was because the Europeans came to East for trade and for conversion, to try to convert pagans. That's what this is getting at. Placing the beliefs in context. Because in some ways, so today I would say, if you believe something, if you believe X, but that belief has no impact on how you live your life or what you do, so what? No, we all have beliefs like that. I believe there are black holes. I don't know there are. I'm not a physicist. I'm not an astrophysicist. But from what I read, I believe what the cutting edge science says about what is known about the universe. It's fantastic and fascinating. It doesn't really affect directly how I live my life or how I view myself. Maybe a bit, maybe just a tiny bit, because it's pretty, it'd be very different if I believe still that, the universe is 6,000 years old and God is just there right above the clouds, almost, so to speak. That would change how I view myself, certainly. But, a new discovery, and whether or not there's a new planet in the solar system. Now, I'm not sure what I believe about that, but that's interesting. But let's say I said, yeah, I believe that. I've been convinced now by that. I believe that there is. So what? It doesn't affect how I live my life. Other beliefs do. What's the function of government, for example? Is government there to help and empower the needy, the vast majority of people, to ensure that there is a common standard? Or is it to ensure the rights of individuals with very limited interference? In some ways, let's say, a hands-on more approach government is the more or less the democratic approach, whereas the hands-off approach is the more Republican, traditionally Republican approach, smaller government and so. And those are different beliefs in terms of what the function and role of government in society. We act differently based on what we believe. That is what I want to get at. How did Europeans from the emergence of the Middle Ages through to the emergence of early modern Europe by 1560, it certainly had been emerged. How did their beliefs affect their actions and their developments? What were the beliefs, and how did the beliefs of Islam affect the development and spread of Islam within particular religious or political entities and territories, or as a politically determined boundaries of governments and states, a doctrine and position. The same with Buddhism. Now, that's what the question is getting at. So I hope you'll bring in detail and specifics. That is usually, again, as I said, preparing for exam one, where students often fall short in answering these kinds of questions. You have to make the general statements supported by as much detail as possible. And detail you get from the textbook and the lectures, the concepts you get from the lectures, and a little bit from the textbook. That's how this is designed, and that's how it's put together. Again, that is how your second exam will be graded, just like the first exam. Is how well you deal with all the material that was presented and applied to this question. Now, that will be that. And you can say, okay, great. If you have questions, please email me again. And again, I'm happy to read drafts, first come, first served basis. And you can just think of it this way. Once you're done with this part 2, you're at least 2/3 finished with the course. Parts 3 and 4 are rather short. There's less reading. The lectures are less lengthy. And I'll be talking about that in the introduction to part 3. But first, you need to get through part 2. And when you have, you should pat yourself on the back and say, I'm almost there. I'm getting there. I did it. Yay. And then take a minute to reflect. What have I learned to this point? I mean, that's a good thing to do at the halfway point, so to speak. And in terms of part 1, 2, and then part 3 and 4, it's halfway after finishing part 2. But in terms of the progression of the course, part 2 ends with week 10. So it's like 2/3, indeed, 2/3 completed. I take a big breath and think, okay, how's my view? How are my beliefs and views changed? Are they? Have they changed as a result of this course? And maybe it might be a good time after you submit exam 2 to then go back, if you haven't already, and look at the assignment for the final essay. That final essay too will be important. And that's asking you to reflect on the whole shebang, so to speak. But we'll get there all in due course. And what is before you right now, the task before you, is exam 2. So good luck. I'm looking forward again to reading your exams. If you have any questions, just ask. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.